Chapter 9:31. Taming the True Trap. The stairs descended to considerable depths before reaching the destination Orion had been directing her toward during the silent walk. They arrived at an area that was very wide, a chamber that had been excavated to unblock the enormous door of the ruin the surface structure guarded. Selphira hadn't felt trapped during the descent because she recognized she could simply destroy the castle walls or stairs to create escape routes if the situation worsened to the point where dodging or flight became necessary. They were standard constructions. Her power could fracture them without serious difficulty. And Orion also hadn't seemed to want to attack her during transit. Behavior consistent with the declaration that negotiation was an option he was willing to seriously consider. It was compliance with the implicit truce, making the situation slightly less tense than it could have been if both had been continuously attacking. But the atmosphere began changing dramatically now that they'd arrived at this underground chamber. The tension that had been manageable intensified to the point where Selphira had to resist the impulse to preventively manifest the fusion. First, there were a few dozen tamers of good level waiting in the chamber, positioned around the perimeter providing coverage from multiple angles. They were all gold rank, without exception of inferior ranks that would dilute the average quality of the force Orion had congregated. And there were even some dual beast tamers among them, members of various families from the factions Orion led, many of whom were acknowledged leaders of their respective lineages. It was an impressive show, a concentration of power representing a significant portion of the rebel faction's total military strength, all gathered here, guarding while waiting for Orion's command. A signal that would begin the violence everyone knew was coming. Still, Selphira didn't feel genuinely threatened being completely recovered thanks to the potion she'd consumed. Those gold ranks couldn't compare with her fusion even operating collectively. And they hadn't received the ability to fuse from Run because only those she and Julius had chosen after exhaustive political investigations were permitted to learn the techniques Run had selectively shared. It was an advantage providing considerable edge in any confrontation where fusion could be deployed. Superiority coming from access to power that enemies didn't possess regardless of how many numbers they could congregate. It would be like a bunch of children against an adult. She could kill them, all of them if it came to that. The fusion would let her operate at basically platinum levels. But killing them would take time, would drain her reserves even with the potion boost, and would leave her vulnerable to Orion while she was occupied with his subordinates. It was better to avoid that bloodshed for both sides. But that was probably the point. They weren't here to defeat her. They may be here to hinder her, to force her spending power fighting them instead of focusing on Orion. It didn't seem to be the case, at least not yet. No bloodthirst could be felt. What she did feel in a manner that was impossible to ignore was the presence of the ruin itself. Not simply a physical structure, but something more fundamental. An emanation suggesting the ancient systems remained active beneath the layers of rock, separating this chamber from technology that the previous civilization had deliberately buried or that had been consumed by time when something on the surface collapsed. It was like standing next to a sleeping giant, something vast and powerful yet dormant. They were installations that maintained themselves through mechanisms modern civilization couldn't replicate. She could feel it humming beneath her feet, energy flowing through conduits that ran through stone like veins through flesh. That was more threatening than the gold rank tamers, because she couldn't destroy it. Fighting tamers was familiar, but ancient technology, that was unknown, could be anything, and that uncertainty was what made it truly dangerous. Orion stopped in front of the enormous door marking the ruins' official entrance. The portal being considerably more impressive than the ordinary doors that surface structures employed. It wasn't just large, but impossibly smooth. No seams or joints, nor visible mechanisms. Just a solid surface that somehow opened when pushed with enough strength to never close again. It was a construction directing toward the first chamber, where, according to information very few knew, they'd fought against a beast from which Cashin had inherited the white egg in the final chamber. Selphira knew the first chamber contained a guardian beast. Defeating it granted passage deeper. Standard ruin configuration that repeated across multiple sites. Orion ordered half a dozen of the most capable tamers to follow him. A selection excluding the vast majority, but specifically including those whose capabilities he valued most highly. And he ordered the rest to guard the enormous door, positioning that would prevent Selphra from easily escaping if she decided retreating when recognizing whatever the trap's nature was that probably waited inside. Forward was the only option. Advance or abandon Victor. Selphra felt a bit more trapped now. Recognition that the walls of this enormous chamber were indestructible for her according to ancient civilization design. Resistance that would exceed what even her fusion could overcome through brute force. It was a limitation reducing escape options in a manner making the situation considerably more dangerous than it had been moments before. She'd relied on knowing she could break through normal construction. That certainty had provided psychological safety even when walking into obvious danger. But ancient materials like these didn't break. So retreating through walls wasn't an option anymore. And retreat through the door meant fighting through dozens of gold-ranked tamers while Orion attacked from behind. Also not a viable option unless she was willing to abandon Victor completely, which left only forward, into whatever Orion had prepared. Into the trap she could feel closing around her with each passing moment. Orion advanced to the entrance of the stairs, descending toward the first challenge chamber, position providing him control over access to the ruin's deeper sections. And there he changed the situation in a manner revealing exactly what type of trap he'd been preparing during all this time. Chapter 932, Taming the True Trap. 2. Orion let the 6 tamers he'd selected pass, and allowed them entering first, ordering them to descend the stairs toward the next chamber to await their prize. Then he deliberately positioned himself to obstruct the entrance, his body still surrounded by the barrier blocking access in a manner that would be impossible to allow without destroying that same barrier. And after a minute, he threw Victor like he was disposable garbage down the stairs. The body rolled without control downward, crystals scraping against stone as it slowly descended. Yet through it all, that faint mana signature still flickered, still persisted despite all that should have extinguished it. Stubbornness or miracle keeping him barely alive through abuse that exceeded anything humans should survive. Orion laughed with satisfaction. He turned to see Selphra, who was now considerably more enraged than she'd been during previous exchanges. Her fury being fed by the unnecessary cruelty Orion exhibited toward a prisoner who couldn't defend himself. "Don't worry," Orion uttered with a tone that was almost conversational in its falseness. "These men are going to wait for him at the bottom of the stairs to play with him a bit. Let's say there is old rivals who don't like him very much, though the rule is they must wait at the end of the stairs." He added with a smile that was absolutely mocking in intent. "But you could go ahead if you want to recover him immediately before they mistreat him too much. However, you have to enter through these specific stairs, following the straight path the ancients, and I have prepared for you so carefully." Selphra realized immediately what Orion was establishing. If she descended through the stairs that were completely straight without curves or alcoves where she could take refuge, she'd have no way to dodge the beam Orion would launch from his elevated position, where he'd have the perfect angle to attack, without her being able to effectively dodge or deflect. The geometry was perfect. From his position at the top of the stairs, he could shoot straight down. It was a simple but effective trap, using terrain and motivation against her, making her choose between accepting a vulnerable position or abandoning her objective. And knowing she couldn't forsake it, that she couldn't let Victor die after coming this far. The stairs were maybe 100 meters long. Straight drop with no landings. She'd be exposed for the entire descent. And if thinking too much, she'd need to arrive among 6 gold-ranked tamers to take Victor from them, while expending the power she'd need for Orion himself. There was no good option. Facing Orion's increasingly mocking smile, Selphra clenched her teeth with force that made her jaw ache. Physical control being the only outlet for fury threatening to overwhelm the discipline she normally maintained to keep emotions appropriately contained. She couldn't jump into such an obvious trap, but she also could not jump into it. Orion elaborated on the situation with a tone that was almost pedagogical, like he was explaining a lesson to a student needing deeper comprehension. I can launch a more powerful beam. This one travels in a spiral and has more power that would make your fusion insufficient to completely protect you as it was for Victor. But if I do that, I have to deactivate the barrier. It couldn't defend me from you if you decide to attack, when I'm committed to that technique requiring considerable concentration. He paused to permit the dilemma's weight to settle before continuing. Besides, that beam is slow if we compare it to the simple black one. Too slow for a slippery old woman like you, who's perfected evasion during hundreds of years. But here in the stairway tunnel, not even someone who can fly as fast as Victor could escape when the space is so confined that maneuvering becomes impossible. It's a perfect zone where speed provides no great advantage. It was an explanation communicating strengths and weaknesses carefully with detail that was almost insulting. He was laying out the entire tactical situation, showing her exactly how the trap worked and making it clear he was confident enough that even with complete information, she couldn't escape it. The spiral beam was devastating but required dropping his defenses. The straight beam was weaker but could be fired while maintaining the barrier. And the stairway eliminated the mobility advantage that would normally let her dodge either one. It was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its effectiveness. It was obvious he wanted to give Selphra hope that the barrier wouldn't be standing if she could overcome the beam, dangling the possibility of victory, making her think that if she just survived the descent, she could reach him, break through his defenses when they were momentarily down, and could end this. But it was bait, obviously bait, and she knew it. Selphra already desperately wanted to save Victor, but she knew perfectly well this was exactly what Orion wanted, eliminating her using the same method that had left Victor in that dying state barely qualifying as living. She clenched her teeth even harder to resist the now greater impulse to launch herself without appropriate consideration of consequences. Control requiring considerable effort when instinct screamed. She needed acting immediately to prevent additional damage being inflicted beneath the stairs, because she could feel them down there. The 6 Tamers positioning themselves around where Victor would land, discussing in voices too low to make out words, but with a tone that promised violence. Old rivals eager to settle scores, to finally have power over a prince who'd once had power over them. And Victor couldn't defend himself. Every second she delayed was a second where they got closer, where Victor's already fragile life became more precarious. But Orion sighed after a moment of observing Selphra's resistance. His expression changed to one of disappointment and acceptance. If you're not going to cooperate, then leave. I'll have to find another way to resolve this later. At least permanently disposing of Victor will be sufficient for this occasion. He's not precious to you, so he no longer serves a useful purpose to me anyway. And he aimed the black beam directly toward the stairs where Victor had fallen, the threat being absolutely clear without needing additional verbal elaboration. Chapter 9:33, Taming the True Trap 3. The energy in Orion's hand promised death as a black-purple light. Not firing yet, but prepared to, just waiting for her decision. Stay or go. Choose now. And they both knew what she'd choose. He'd calculated this perfectly. Finally, Selphra couldn't resist anymore. She transformed in an explosion of mana that made the air around her cool precipitously, the fusion activating in a fraction of a second. And she launched toward the entrance with a furious look communicating exactly what she'd do to Orion if she managed to get out of there. Not a threat, but a promise. After she survived this, and she would survive this, she'd make him regret every choice that had led to this moment. All of it would be repaid with interest that would make his current confidence seem like a tragic miscalculation. Orion removed himself from the entrance instantaneously to let her pass. The movement being smooth suggested he'd been expecting this still. He'd known exactly what buttons to push, known how much pressure to apply before she snapped, and did exactly what he wanted. Was he watching that intently all those afternoons when Sirius trained with her? Barely a second after Selphira passed through the threshold, Orion repositioned himself at the entrance with the barrier still active, a blockage preventing her from retreating to escape from the trap into which she'd voluntarily entered. The black beam, already charged, began launching immediately, a projection converging toward Selphira's back that was vulnerable during the instant where she was completely committed to forward movement until reaching Victor. But she still covered herself with ice armor she'd anticipated manifesting. The protection ended up absorbing the blow and giving her more forward speed. The ice cracked but held long enough. Selphira reached Victor about 20 meters before he would have reached completely to the bottom of the stairs where the 6 dual-beast tamers Orion had sent ahead were waiting. Her speed was sufficient to intercept the fall with space to spare. She had the option of exiting the stairs' confined tunnel and fighting with the 6 tamers in the more open space where mobility would provide advantage. But Victor was literally in his final moments, life being sustained by a margin so narrow that any additional perturbation could end it permanently. She had to restore him immediately before considering any confrontation with enemies. Every second counted, and every delay increased the risk that he'd die before she could stabilize him. And she'd have come all this way, sprung all these traps, expended an irreplaceable potion. Would that be just to watch him die in her arms because she'd been too slow? Unacceptable. Selphira decided to give absolute priority to healing. The rescue didn't serve its purpose if Victor died during the extraction process. So she invested a good quantity of mana and covered the tunnel with ice from both sides, taking advantage of the moment between Orion's first and second beam. And below it worked better, where the 6 tamers were beginning to ascend to reach her. Having sensed that the initial situation of Victor reaching the bottom had been prevented, they tried to cheat going up, but 3 ended up frozen. It'd take them some minutes to free themselves. It was an expensive technique, supposing an investment of approximately 10% of her mana in a powerful long-range ability, creating a plug of ice barriers that were considerably more resistant than her normal ice would be. The ice wasn't simple frozen water. It was reinforced with tons of mana that made it very sturdy. Not impenetrable, but resilient enough to buy time measured in seconds or even minutes rather than milliseconds. For now, the 6 tamers couldn't reach her easily, a separation providing precious moments she needed to stabilize Victor's condition. Though she recognized that on the other side, Orion's beams would destroy the ice considerably faster than the gold tamers could. She calculated she should have barely sufficient time for at least initial healing before the 80 meters of the upper ice barrier completely collapsed. It was a powerful barrier, but very costly. Using it too much would only give Orion target for his beam and would waste her mana much faster, in a few minutes. But this once was all she needed. The water and light mana she controlled at expert level, additionally amplified by the potion's effects she'd just consumed, flowed toward Victor in a constant current, beginning to repair the damage that captivity's abuses had caused. It was healing operating at levels no healer in the kingdom could equal. Water mended torn tissues and reconnected severed vessels. Light flushed corruption from systems barely functioning, burned away the foreign energies trying to establish themselves in his mana channels. And together they worked miracles, taking a body that should have been a corpse and dragging it back from the edge of death through sheer force of will and centuries of accumulated skill. Victor woke up gasping after barely 3 seconds of intense treatment. Consciousness returned abruptly in a manner that was disorienting when the last memory had been pain and darkness without apparent end. Then suddenly this, cold air, warm hands, someone shouting his name through what sounded like underwater echoes. But still, he remained practically incapacitated despite recovering his consciousness. His system didn't stop being affected by crystallization. That was something perhaps only Run could heal, and probably only partially. Victor's crystals were enormous and platinum rank, according to the analysis Selphira could make, feeling the mana density they contained. They weren't anything like the small gold and silver rank crystals that had affected Zhao during the previous incident that had been resolved by Ren relatively easily. Though they weren't as impossibly difficult as completely decrystallizing a diamond energy statue like Dragarian, they also weren't something achievable without considerable effort and risk of causing more damage during the removal process. Still, Selphra was considerably more hopeful now that she had Victor in her hands. Physical contact permitting her to directly monitor his condition rather than simply observing him being dragged from a distance. Chapter 9:34. Taming the Bird's Pain. It was an improvement, transforming the situation from desperation to difficult, but potentially surmountable challenge. He was alive. That was a victory already. Everything else was just details to be managed. The prince looked at Selphra intently, and she saw his mouth opening slowly as the healing was finishing. Victor's first word wasn't a question or complaint. It was, "Sorry." His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and damaged, but unmistakably sincere. "I'm sorry," he repeated, stronger this time. "I'm so sorry." He broke off coughing, blood flecking his lips, the crystals in his throat making speech painful. But he pushed through it. I failed again. I was stupid. Hush, Selphra said, but gently, without the harshness that usually characterized their communications. Save your strength. No, Victor's hand, the one that wasn't fully crystallized, reached up to grasp her arm. Weak grip, but insistent. I wanted to prove myself. The words came in a rush now. To father, to the kingdom, to myself. I'm the oldest prince, yet never adequate as my father's replacement. Never excellent. Never terrible. Just eternally, frustratingly mediocre. His voice cracked, not from his horrible pain, from something deeper. Selphra felt something twist in her chest. Pity and guilt as she'd thought of him exactly that way. I thought if I could be useful, Victor continued, voice dropping to whisper again. He laughed, bitter sound that turned into cough again. Stupid, right? I was so desperate to prove Turns out I was just being a fool. Again, like always. Victor, Selphra grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her, see her eyes, to understand that she was actually listening rather than just waiting for him to finish. You are not a fool, she uttered with conviction. You are not useless. You are Victor, my student, my responsibility, my family. You are just unlucky. And also you are loved not because of what you might someday be useful for, but because you are ours. I'm also foolish for being here with you, she admitted honestly, not trying to hide behind professional bravado. But I wouldn't have done it any differently, regardless of the consequences. It was a statement that communicated exactly how much she valued Victor, despite the frustrations his behavior had caused over years of their complex interactions. Victor's eyes widened, like he'd been struck, since he'd never believed he would hear those words from that strict Selphra before today. Maybe he hadn't. He was dreaming. But Victor started crying, silently at first, then with full-body sobs that made the crystals in his chest grind together painfully. But he couldn't stop. The words hung between them, filling space that had been empty for too long, healing wounds that physical medicine couldn't touch, giving validation that Victor had been starving for without knowing what he needed. Above them, Orion had changed from a simple black beam to the infamous spiral black and white one. Selphra's ice barrier fragmented fast. Orion's next beam would likely have a clear shot. Below them, the 6 Tamers were escaping the ice and melting some now, climbing toward them with old grievances fresh in their minds. Time was up. The small moment to talk was over, and reality was crashing back in. But something had changed in Victor's eyes, in the way he held himself despite the pain, and in the set of his jaw beneath the tears. He wasn't fully healed, not physically. The crystals still grew from his flesh, and part of his body was still broken. His mana system was still damaged, perhaps beyond complete repair. But something inside had mended, something that mattered more than flesh or mana or power. He knew he mattered, not as a soldier or prince, but as a person, as family, as Victor, and that was worth more than any treasure or title. Victor recognized the beam pattern immediately, a traumatic memory triggered by the energy vision that had reduced him to this state of being. If that hits you for too long, You'll end up exactly like me, he warned, his voice carrying the urgency born of direct experience with what the beam could do. Selfra responded with the dark humor characteristic of how she handled impossible situations, a lightness that made horror more tolerable through acknowledging the absurd. Don't worry. We'll push him back and get out of here to at least give that damned Orion a good hit, even if we have to leave with our hands and feet completely crystallized. She paused before adding with a smile that was genuine despite the circumstances. That way they'll hurt more when I use them to hit him over the head. Victor sighed with a small smile. You won't be able to push the beam if you fight it with your own mana. It needs to be pushed with a lot of strength, physically. I may not look as big as a young man, but I'm also strong. I won't let you die here, Victor interrupted. Voice steady now despite the earlier tears, despite the pain, despite everything. We'll use my crystal arm as our shield. You're in no condition to. I know, grim smile, but I'll still have one good arm. Let me finally do something that counts. Selfra wanted to argue, but she saw it in his eyes. The determination, the need not to prove himself to her, but to prove himself to himself. And who was she to refuse him that? She just told him he wasn't useless. Fine, she said, but you follow my lead. Don't take stupid risks, and don't try to be a hero. You contribute what you can safely contribute, and no more. Understood. Understood. He smiled, a real big smile this time. Thank you for coming. For everything, for what any good teacher does for her students. Selfra stood, helping him up. Now let's show these bastards why it's a mistake to trap the two members of the Ashenway family in confined spaces. I'm not Ashenway. You're now a little bird. You got yourself saved by the old lady that rescues pitiful kids from the roads, earning a place in a family that mostly chooses its members rather than inheriting them. Welcome. Sing something to me later. Victor's eyes widened, then filled with tears again, but different, not despair, not shame, but gratitude. Chapter 9:35, Taming Rationing. On Ren's side, the situation had deteriorated considerably as time advanced from when the initial defense had been established. What had begun as a coordinated effort by hundreds of combatants had now been reduced to resistance, sustained by fewer than 100 defenders. Attrition having removed those with lesser reserves or whose beasts had been incapacitated by cumulative damage. Not many dead, mostly just exhausted beyond ability to contribute. But the effect on the defensive capability was the same, and the mutants kept coming, endless, like a tide that never retreated. Just wave after wave breaking against the defensive line that grew thinner with each assault. Only the highest power levels remained active in relevant combat capacity. The silver-ranked students who'd contributed valiantly during the initial phase were now mostly withdrawn. Exhaustion forcing them to positions where they could recover under the protection of those who still had energy to continue. They'd done their part, had fought until they literally couldn't anymore, until their beasts refused manifesting because there was no mana left to sustain them. Now they huddled in the upper stands, trying to meditate, to recover even fragments of their spent reserves, knowing that if the defensive line broke, they'd be defenseless and unable to fight, just targets waiting for slaughter. But even among those who remained fighting, efficiency was degrading as fatigue made techniques they'd normally execute perfectly become less precise, more costly in terms of mana spent for result achieved. It was like trying to write with numb fingers. The knowledge was there, the skill existed, but the body wasn't responding correctly. Every technique took longer to manifest, required more concentration, and consumed more energy because the channels weren't flowing smoothly anymore. Ren was beginning to feel the toll from the prolonged battle against men that had preceded this massive assault. The Wolverine, which had fought consecutively against the amphibian and then the serpent without rest between confrontations, was running out of energy, making its effectiveness fall notably. Ren could feel it through the bond. The creature's frustration and its determination to keep fighting despite exhaustion. But determination didn't create mana from nothing. Willpower couldn't sustain combat indefinitely. Luna had taken the lead in eliminating corrupt beasts, her wolf and tiger working in coordination. They moved like extensions of her will, covering weaknesses and operating with synchronization that made them deadlier than their individual capabilities suggested. And she was being effectively supported by Leora and Larissa, the three forming a resistance core that was already better than Ren alone. They kept their defense sector functioning when others were collapsing under pressure. It was an impressive coordination, three powerful Tamers working as a unit. But some of it came at a cost. Leora's bash had especially exploited the absorption ability to maintain itself considerably more active than other beasts, depending solely on their own reserves. The capacity to steal energy from mutants it eliminated provided constant supply, extending sustainability beyond what would normally be possible. It was a tactical advantage that had permitted Leora to contribute at levels exceeding what her power level alone would justify. Every mutant the bash killed became fuel, mana reclaimed from corruption and converted into power that could kill more mutants. It was beautiful efficiency, a self-sustaining cycle that should have let her fight indefinitely. Should have, but there was always a catch. The corruption impregnating the energy the bash absorbed was beginning to affect it in worrying ways. Contamination appearing as distortion in the beast's aura and as interference in Leora's mana channels that transported energy between tamer and creature. The channels that should have been clear spiritual conduits were turning dark, murky, like clean water becoming polluted. It wasn't a problem yet, but it was deterioration accumulating with each additional absorption. A warning that the technique that had been so effective had hidden costs that could eventually result in serious consequences. Leora could feel it, a wrongness, like drinking water that tasted slightly off, like something foreign in her system that didn't belong, something her mana immune system was trying to purge but couldn't quite eliminate. It was getting worse. Each absorbed mutant added more corruption. Larissa insisted with growing urgency upon seeing the blackened channels in her sworn sister's skin that she shouldn't do it anymore. The channels were visible now, dark lines running under Leora's skin like bruises, spreading from where the bash bond connected to her cultivation base, creeping outward with each absorption, getting darker and wider. We don't know what corruption can do to you long-term, Larissa argued with a worried voice, carrying the trauma of having seen Ren covered by corruption and attacking his allies in a situation she'd arrived almost too late to reverse. That memory haunted her, Ren's eyes vacant and his power turned against those he cared about. Corruption had gotten into his system and hijacked his control. She wouldn't let that happen to Leora. Couldn't. The risk was unacceptable regardless of present benefits. It's not worth the risk when we don't completely understand the consequences, she continued. Try to make Leora see reason. You could be permanently damaging yourself. Leora acceded momentarily, withdrawing the bash from active absorption mode and limiting techniques to those depending only on internal reserves. But she maintained with determination, admitting no debate that she'd have to do it again if the defense fell even further. If the situation deteriorated to the point where immediate survival mattered more than concerns about long-term health. If the alternative is permitting everyone to die because I was too cautious, then I'll accept those contamination's consequences. It was a declaration that Larissa couldn't honestly refute without denying the reality of the desperate situation they faced. So she simply nodded with reluctant acceptance, communicating continued disagreement, but understanding of the underlying logic. Sometimes you had to choose between bad options and worse ones. And watching everyone die to preserve your own health was definitely worse. But she didn't have to like it, and she'd be watching, ready to pull Leora back the moment the contamination became critical, even if it meant fighting Leora to save her from herself. Luna, beside them during the exchange, said nothing verbally but analyzed her own situation with attention coming from recognizing worrying similarities. The elemental absorption of her wolf had also evolved, the capacity refining itself to the point where now it stole energy from anything touching the shadows it projected. Chapter 936, Taming Rationing 2. Luna's wolf also had a powerful absorption skill now. It was the ability she'd wanted to use for surprising Ren during the final battle that had never truly begun. A technique she'd been saving as a trump card. but she'd been using it semi-passively for a while now during the Academy's defense. Absorption occurring almost automatically when mutants entered contact with the darkness the wolf constantly generated. It was giving her an efficiency flow, permitting the wolf to recover energy without needing active concentration on the process. An advantage maintaining the wolf operating at high levels when other beasts were degrading under continuous stress. The wolf's shadow wasn't just darkness. It was hungry now, drinking in energy from anything that touched it, growing stronger as enemies fell into its embrace. And Luna had felt the difference. The wolf was fresher than it should be, operating above baseline despite hours of sustained combat. But at what cost? However, Luna hadn't felt any of the corruption effects Leora was clearly experiencing. Her wolf seemed to process stolen energy without contamination affecting bonds or mana channels yet. A cleansing occurring in a manner Luna didn't completely understand, but that was undeniably beneficial. Was her wolf different from Leora's bash in ways going beyond simple specialization in elemental absorption? Maybe it was the shadow element itself? Or maybe it was something about the wolf specifically, some property of its unique nature that made it immune to contamination that affected other absorbing creatures. Or maybe, and this was the thought that worried her, maybe the corruption was just hiding, operating on a deeper level, accumulating in places she couldn't see yet. She took it with appropriate caution, recognizing that absence of symptoms didn't guarantee the problem didn't exist. Perhaps she hadn't felt them yet, because her absorption was slower or less direct. A difference in methodology, meaning contamination accumulated at a rate that hadn't reached a perceptible threshold yet. For Luna's limited knowledge, there was no definitive answer. So she maintained vigilance over her own condition while continuing to permit some absorption to operate, because the tactical benefit was too valuable to sacrifice based on an hypothetical concern. But she'd be watching, ready to cut off absorption the moment she detected contamination beginning. Better to catch it early, before it became a problem requiring outside intervention, and she became a liability like Run had been in Larissa's story when corruption took him. Luna and Leora had powerful absorption, yet even without it, Larissa seemed to be quite effective despite her fairy being generally more defensive by nature and better for tactical positioning than direct offense. But now that light had emerged as the default most effective element against mutants, she'd shifted to a more aggressive role, exploiting the elemental advantage she possessed. Pure light projectiles cut through corrupt creatures with ease other elements didn't match. Maybe an inherent purification in the attack, causing damage exceeding what raw power alone would explain. And against creatures that were fundamentally corrupt, that purification was more devastating than any physical damage could be. All the other allies close to Run were sustaining formation. Taro with his terror and Beetle still providing solid defensive support. Their armored bulk creating a physical barrier that channeled enemy movement into kill zones. Lu contributed area control that slowed enemy approaches. Plus the groups of students from Roran's team, girls like Sora and Mira, and professional guards, all found themselves in joint defensive formation operating well considering the adverse circumstances. The coordination they'd perfected during training was now being applied. And despite real combat stress, they performed with professionalism, justifying the confidence Ren had placed in them. Ren had empowered them, and that plus the training was paying off. They weren't panicking and weren't breaking formation, but exhaustion was still widespread and obvious. In how movements became slower, in how reactions that should be instantaneous now required additional fraction of second to process. An accumulation of fatigue that couldn't be denied regardless of how strong determination was. Even Ren's parents, who'd been fighting alongside him with their silver 3 tortoises and plants mature beyond the first maturation that the failed cultivation gives, were now beginning to run out of capacity to extract and process mana at rates sustaining continuous combat. Not that their reserves were completely exhausted, but their conversion efficiency had fallen dramatically too. They were older and not as resilient as some of the gold-rank students. bodies that had accumulated decades of wear now being pushed beyond safe operational limits. But they kept fighting because their son was here, because students he taught them about growing up were here, and because retreat wasn't an option when family was at stake. Imran saw it, saw his father's hands shaking between techniques, saw his mother's breathing becoming labored. He wanted to tell them to rest, to withdraw to safety, and to let him handle this. But he also knew they wouldn't listen, knew that suggesting it would only hurt them and would make them feel useless when feeling useful was the only thing keeping them going. So he said nothing. Master Lin, who'd been operating on multiple fronts almost simultaneously and coordinating defenses while directly contributing to threat elimination, executed a kick contacting with a mutant's head with force that completely tore the appendage from the body. It was demonstration of amplified physical power that few could equal. The technique was perfect, an optimal impact with devastating force. The mutant's head didn't just separate, it exploded into fragments that scattered across the battlefield. But 3 more beasts immediately advanced to fill the void. And while Lin recovered from the kick's extension, others began devouring the fallen mutant's corpse with voracity, communicating a hunger going beyond simple feeding instinct. It was disturbing in implications about what exactly they were facing. Were they feeding to gain strength? To absorb the corrupted energy from the fallen? Or was it just mindless hunger driving them to consume anything organic regardless of source? Lin didn't know, and not knowing was itself disturbing, because unknown enemy capabilities were the most dangerous kind. Chapter 9:37, Taming Rationing 3. Lin retreated toward Ren's group's defensive circle. Maintaining an advanced position was no longer sustainable when support had diminished. She looked at Ren with an expression assessing his condition quickly. Professional observation identifying exhaustion signs he probably didn't completely recognize in himself. And something else, a small resonance familiar from that battle where she'd fought him more seriously. She couldn't see the black marks on his chest, but could already perceive them slightly. That black corruption trying to take root again, now still barely perceptible, but present. Stop projecting your beasts externally, she proposed with a tone that was directive without being authoritarian. It's taking too much from you. Better to use your beast with your body. It's more efficient in terms of mana spent for results achieved. Ren responded with an objection having genuine tactical merit. That way I can't use larger techniques to defend more people simultaneously. The big projections permit me to cover an area that close combat doesn't reach. It was a valid argument Lin didn't dismiss without consideration, but she countered with logic prioritizing sustainability over maximum impact. It's better if you're somewhat useful for a more prolonged time than considerably more useful, but lasting much less. If you exhaust yourself completely now, you won't be available when the situation deteriorates even more. And it definitely will deteriorate more before improving if nobody arrives to help us. Ren processed the evaluation for a few seconds before acknowledging with a small nod, understanding of the underlying wisdom even if he didn't completely like it. He fused with the Hydra, permitting the beast characteristics to integrate with his human form in a transformation feeling natural by now. Years of practice, not in vain. The changes were immediate. His skin taking on faint scales, his eyes shifting to reflect serpentine qualities, and his senses sharpening as the Hydra's perception merged with his own. Power flooding through systems designed to channel it efficiently, but also restraint. The fusion was contained, more concentrated. Not an explosive release of mana, but controlled application of sustainable force. Like switching from sprint to marathon pace. Less impressive, but more relaxed. Lin began guiding him in close-range mutant elimination with full physical or at most cheap short-range attacks, maximizing efficiency. Techniques costing a fraction of what distance projections required, but equally lethal when correctly applied. Clawed strikes infused with light element, or hits channeling venomous energy that was actually compressed mana dissolving inside structures. Even sweeps or throws using small help from earth manipulation to carry and crush multiple enemies simultaneously by ramming them into each other. It was a good strategy adjustment, recognizing the reality that attrition war favored the side that could maintain pressure during extended period. The approach proved quite effective in terms of mana spent versus mutants eliminated ratio. Ren killed more mutants per unit of energy now. He could feel the difference immediately. The drain was slowing. This could work. This could let him fight for some more hours if needed. Could give them chance at surviving until reinforcements arrived or the invasion exhausted itself. But if they didn't, Lin must have seen his hesitation. You're doing as much as you can. His teacher was right, yet Ren was already starting to see the lack of overall impact. The absence of his large area skills that had been simultaneously clearing groups of mutants meant the elimination was becoming slower in aggregate pace, even if more sustainable. It was a trade-off they had to accept when the alternative was complete defensive collapse, when resources were prematurely exhausted. But seeing the consequences in real time was different from understanding the theory. Where he'd once cleared dozen mutants with a single skill, now he killed them one at a time. Where barriers of Earth had once channeled entire waves into kill zones, now he intercepted individual threats as they came. Even if he could fight 10 times longer with this approach, if he was killing mutants at 1/3 the rate, the net effect was probably negative because other defenders couldn't compensate for the lost area denial. The mutants were recognizing the situation too. The human defenders were weakening, so they pressed harder, and the defense line bent further, straining toward a breaking point that was approaching whether they acknowledged it or not. They weren't far from being exhausted. The teachers were almost completely depleted too. Instructors who'd begun the battle with confidence in their capabilities now operated on reserves bordering on dangerous. You could see it in their movements, the hesitation, the careful rationing of every attack. They were mostly professionals, had fought in wars, and had experience managing resources during extended conflicts. But experience didn't create mana from nothing. They were running on fumes, and everyone knew it. The students could see their teachers struggling and started to sense the fear beneath professional exteriors. If the teachers fell, what hope did the students have? Even Yang, whose behemoth had been a defensive pillar literally crushing hundreds of mutants, was close to having to withdraw his beast before the bond broke on its own and left him exposed. It was a decision he hated contemplating, because he knew the behemoth's absence would create a gap in the defensive line that would be difficult to compensate for with the few resources remaining. The behemoth had been an anchor, an immovable point around which the defense organized. Its massive body-blocking approaches and its skills creating barriers that channeled enemy movement. Its mere presence had been deterring mutants from committing fully to attacks. Remove it, and the entire tactical structure collapsed. Defenders would have to reorganize and establish new coordination, all while under sustained assault from enemies who wouldn't give them time to adapt. It would be chaos, and chaos in a defensive battle usually meant massacre. Yang stared at his beast, at the cracks forming in its stone skin and the way it moved slower with each passing minute. He had maybe 10 minutes, maybe even less before the choice was made for him and the bond shattered from overextension. 10 minutes to find a solution that didn't exist. But he'd keep trying anyway, because the alternative was unacceptable. Yet the situation escalated dramatically before that. There was a breach in the upper defense. A perimeter section supposed to be secured failed when other combatants maintaining it finally succumbed to exhaustion and were overwhelmed by numbers exceeding their capacity to contain. It happened fast. One moment the line was holding, next it was gone. Sudden collapse as 3 defenders fell simultaneously and mutants poured through the gap. Some mutants managed to climb to the top of the stands where non-combatant civilians had been evacuated, believing until now that the elevation would provide security against threats appearing primarily at ground level. That they could shelter here while stronger people handled the fighting below. They were wrong. The mutants broke through the rock barrier established as the final protection line. The penetration creating panic among the vulnerable population that didn't have effective means of defending themselves against silver-rank creatures now directly threatening them, screaming and pushing each other in desperation to escape. parents grabbing their children, and elderly being knocked down in the chaos. The civilians had beasts even if they were weak. Iron and bronze ranks that in normal circumstances wouldn't be sent to combat against serious threats. But desperation forced action. Ordinary people fighting with everything they had available to protect their families and neighbors. It was bravery that was admirable, even if effectiveness was limited. Resistance buying precious seconds until help could arrive from main defensive positions. More capable tamers responded to the emergency as quickly as they could disengage from their own confrontations. But it took time, and in those minutes before help arrived, people died, were injured or traumatized in ways that would never fully heal. The smell hit Rin before he saw the aftermath. Blood, lots of it, mixed with the wrongness of corruption. The acrid stench of dissolved flesh where mutant attacks had landed. The copper taste in the air that came from violence on a scale that overwhelmed his senses. Then he saw the bodies. Civilians who'd been caught, partially devoured, left in pieces that would haunt dreams of everyone who witnessed them. And among them, people he recognized. Families of students who'd come to watch the exams. There were casualties among those who defended the last position before reinforcement arrived. And more disturbingly for him, among the wounded were members of Ren's team. Specifically those who'd run out of mana during the previous battle phase and had been withdrawn to positions supposed to be safe. Safe, the word felt like mockery now, like a cruel joke. There was no safe. The mutants were everywhere, and they were winning. Ron, who'd been one of the first entering the final exam battle before everything collapsed into the present crisis, received a large chest cut when a mutant reached him before he could appropriately evade. It was a wound that was critical in depth. Damage to tissues and possibly internal organs requiring immediate medical attention or risk of death from internal bleeding that couldn't stop without intervention. Ron was conscious, barely, eyes wide with shock, pain, and fear. Hands pressed against the wound, trying to stem bleeding that wouldn't stop. Breathing in shallow gasps that made the cut open wider with each inhalation. He needed a healer urgently. But most of those with healing capabilities were completely oversaturated, divided among dozens of wounded, all needing attention that couldn't simultaneously be provided to everyone. The seed in Ren's core began vibrating stronger. Chapter 938, Taming Rage. Triage had become a nightmare. Deciding who to save, who had a chance of survival, versus who was already lost. Making choices that would haunt healers forever, but that had to be made because resources were finite and wounded seemed infinite. Ren watched the situation unfold with growing concern. He fought to keep out of his facial expression. But internally he processed the reality that they were losing. That without a change in circumstances, they couldn't sustain defense long enough for help to arrive. The math was inescapable. Defenders decreasing, new mutants' arrival still constant, defensive lines shrinking, casualties mounting, and resources depleting. Every metric pointed toward inevitable collapse. Just a question of when. Hours? Minutes? Would help even arrive? The thought crept in despite his efforts to suppress it. The possibility that no one was coming. That the kingdom was focusing resources on defending many sides of the outside city walls instead. Ron was dying, and Ren couldn't save him. Couldn't do anything except watch and hope someone else would handle it, because he had to keep fighting to prevent even more people from dying. It was a failure, complete and total, and it was happening in real time while he stood helpless to prevent it. The seed in Ren's core began vibrating stronger. The dark energy leaking from its fissure intensified, spreading from his core outward, affecting the Hydra's bond, touching the Wolverine despite its exhaustion. Power was building. He could sense it, not as power, not the Hydras or Wolverines, but something else, something that had been sleeping under control and was now waking again because the situation facilitated it. Ren didn't understand it, didn't know if it was helpful or dangerous, didn't know if he should encourage it or suppress it. But he knew they were losing, knew people were dying, knew that without change they would all die here today. And the seed was offering change, was offering power, was offering something that might make difference between victory and defeat. So he didn't fight it anymore. Ron still desperately needed a healer, but most of those with healing abilities were completely overwhelmed. It was triage that prioritized those with the best chance of survival, a brutal calculation no healer wanted to do, but which necessity forced when resources were insufficient to meet demand. And Ron was in the difficult intermediate category, the wound being serious, but not mortal if stabilized immediately, but requiring that almost immediate attention and transport taking time that healers didn't have available when others were literally dying in front of them. Ron was delayed, would live if treated soon, but soon was a relative term measured in minutes rather than hours. And minutes were commodities they didn't have when immediate cases consumed every healer's attention. So he unintentionally waited while bleeding, sliding without options slowly towards his death from the delayed attention. From salvageable toward lost cause. He wasn't close to a healer apart from Min, and Min had no mana left, who had knowledge but not power, who could only watch and hope someone else arrived before it was too late. The situation worsened with each passing second, defenders being worn down faster than they could recover, while the mutant flow still showed no signs of ceasing. They still needed something to change. Rin felt something dark awaken in his chest when he saw Ron being ignored by oversaturated healers trying to prioritize among dozens of wounded. It was growing fury he'd been containing less and less throughout the entire battle, an emotion he'd suppressed beneath the necessity of maintaining appropriate focus on efficient execution. But the vision of his close companion bleeding critically while help delayed too long made him discard the control he'd been maintaining with conscious effort, and he began losing command of his energy. The first sign was the speed, movements becoming faster and reactions sharper, but not in a controlled way, in a frantic one. Then came the brutality, his strikes destroying nearby mutants with violence exceeding what he'd been demonstrating moments before, each blow carrying more than necessary force, carrying rage that had been building for hours and was finally finding an outlet. Exoskeletons didn't just crack. They exploded into fragments that scattered like shrapnel. Skulls didn't just break. They burst, spraying matter that painted nearby surfaces in ugly colors that shouldn't exist in living things. Each elimination being executed with intensity, communicating this was no longer simply defense, but some type of imaginary vengeance. Personal vendetta against creatures that had dared threatening people he cared about, that had dared making him feel helpless. It was violence that went beyond efficiency into territory that was primal. Lin noticed immediately what was occurring. Recognition coming from having taught Ren for several years and differentiating his actions when affected by influences, however minor, that compromised his judgment. The black lines she'd noticed in Ren's core during that time were more pronounced now. Dark veins expanding visibly beneath the surface. It was happening again. The corruption Selphira told her about was taking hold. "Run," she called with a voice projecting a bit of panic this time. "You need to calm down. Control your breathing and focus." It was advice she'd given rarely to someone like Run, who normally never permitted emotions to exceed the discipline learned from her. Principles that should have been reflexive, that should have triggered an automatic response the moment she invoked them. But Ren didn't respond to her direction this time in the manner he normally did, continuing his assault against mutants with intensity that didn't diminish when instruction should have provoked reflexive adjustment. Like he couldn't hear her, or heard but didn't care, or cared but couldn't stop even if he wanted to. The corruption was winning. Ren's father seemed to notice the situation, observing from his position in the defensive formation center, seeing how his son was losing control while simultaneously processing that Ron and other wounded needed attention he could provide if he managed to reach them. Reed was a healer. He could save Ron, could make a difference if he could just reach him. He seemed to want to exit the protected perimeter to go heal those in the breach that had been partially secured but still contained wounded awaiting treatment. But as soon as he tried exiting the formation's edge, the mutant flow pushing intensified dramatically against the defense. Like they'd been waiting. The lack of defenders worsened with attempts supporting the upper breach. force redistribution, creating weaknesses in other sections, then requiring additional reinforcements. A cycle degrading overall perimeter integrity with each adjustment. And with deteriorating coverage in more zones came attack intensification. It was cascading failure. Reed didn't manage exiting the defensive circle. No matter how much Lin tried calming him with words and with physical presence near Run that normally would provide rationality's anchor, he entered more deeply into desperation as he felt Ron's mana signature weakening at the distance. It was Ren's advanced perception of energy signatures, permitting approximate condition tracking without needing visual contact. And feeling Ron fading pushed Run to increasingly aggressive actions. Like he was certain his brutality and mutant elimination speed could somehow compensate for his inability to reach the friends slowly dying while overloaded healers couldn't provide desperately needed attention. The black veins consumed him more visibly with each passing second. Corruption expanding to the point where they were no longer simply subtle lines beneath skin, but obvious manifestations any observer could notice if paying appropriate attention. They crawled up his neck, across his jaw, reaching toward his face like grasping fingers. And there came the moment where Rin simply stopped caring about the secret he'd been guarding so carefully. Electricity began manifesting around his strikes, sparks jumping between fingers when fist connected with corrupt flesh, discharges propagating through mutant bodies and causing spasms, incapacitating them more effectively. It was the element he'd kept hidden even to the end, the capability only a very small circle of friends knew he possessed, and he was revealing it now, in front of everyone. But he didn't care, couldn't care because Ron was dying and that mattered more than some hypothetical advantage. Who'd become friend through shared struggle. The electricity wasn't subtle, wasn't a quiet discharge barely noticeable in combat chaos. It was lightning, arcing and jumping, bright enough to cast shadows. Each punch landed with impact that made mutants seize, nervous systems overloading and muscles contracting uncontrollably. It was devastating, more effective than any element he'd shown before, because corruption might resist normal elements. But electricity was an offensive and chaotic light. But fortunately for Run, with Chaos's onset, the Tamers who'd been assigned specifically monitoring him weren't close now. They'd been withdrawn, monitoring external areas to facilitate mutant flow or report to Orion the Academy attack situation for macro rather than micro aspects. Since crystal control wasn't individual but flow-based, that semi-absence provided a small window where this revelation wouldn't be immediately noticed by those who'd report for the moment. Lucky timing, or unlucky depending on perspective, because it also meant they were making sure no one escaped or sent signals for help outside the Academy, eliminating the messenger birds. Chapter 939, Taming Rage 2. Rin destroyed every beast in his path, while launching himself at the maximum speed his last hidden element permitted, the trajectory being a direct line toward where Ron lay bleeding, abandoning all caution in favor of his raging urgency that tolerated no delay. He was basically a blur. Lightning made flesh and leaving a trail of destroyed mutants behind him. Some defenders saw him pass and registered vaguely that it was Run. But combat demanded attention, and analyzing too closely was a luxury they couldn't afford when mutants were still coming. Arriving at the upper breach, he found a scene making his fury intensify, and some softer feeling difficult to appropriately name, because Min was kneeling beside Ron with his hands completely covered in blood. Not just stains, covered, like he'd plunged them into a crimson pool and pulled them out dripping, red from fingertips to wrists and soaking into his sleeves. Pressure being applied to the chest wound in an effort to stop or at least slow the bleeding, threatening to end Ron's life very soon. It wasn't working, not really. Blood still flowed, poured from a wound that was too deep and too wide for simple pressure to seal. All Min was doing was buying maybe some extra seconds of time. He had been trying to use his water mana to heal to no avail. Normally, he'd make a joke about being unable to use his only important utility as the group's water duel Tamer. Self-deprecating humor that deflected from the genuine skill he possessed. But now it was no joke, only the terrible desperation of someone knowing he had no way of executing his healing without mana. Failing miserably in his effort, while crying because he no longer had a way to help. Even the simplest energy manipulation attempts didn't work when none of his beasts were available to help him channel. But he was still trying anyway, forcing it, pushing against empty reserves, trying to squeeze out drops that didn't exist. He kept crying quietly, subtle tears easily missed, no open weeping. Just sobs shaking his shoulders as tears mixed with the blood on his hands. Voice breaking as he begged Ron to hold on. To stay alive and don't dare die, because Min couldn't save him. It was devastating in its helplessness. But at least the physical pressure he applied had reduced bleeding somewhat. Manual compression being better than nothing. Small mercy since. Min looked up when Ron arrived in an energy explosion. His expression showing relief mixed with desperation coming from the urgency and doubt if he would still see Ron die without having been able to do anything effective for preventing the outcome seeming inevitable. Ron, voice cracking. I can't, there's no mana. I tried, but he didn't say anything beyond that. Simply maintained pressure while waiting for Ron to do what he couldn't. Luckily, Ron had power, had the ability to tread mana even after hours of fighting, and had the knowledge and skill needed to save Ron. So Min held the wound closed, waited and hoped he'd bought enough time. Ren eliminated the remaining abyssal creatures flowing toward the wall breach with brutal efficiency, leaving no survivors. Electricity jumping between enemies in chain, incapacitating them simultaneously. Systematic annihilation of everything threatening the area where Ron lay dying in Min's arms. And then he knelt beside them, hands already moving with dense mana to accelerate the healing processes. Water and light flowing toward the wound in an almost uncontrolled current. Tissues being repaired at a rate exceeding by a lot what a body would achieve in days of ordinary recovery. It wasn't complete healing that would immediately restore Ron to combat condition, but it was a stabilization stopping the bleeding and repairing some critical damage to organs compromised by the deep cut. Take him. Ren ordered Min with a voice sounding strange even to his own ears, tone being harsher than normal, like his vocal cords were under tension affecting their sound production, like something was wrong with the throat or lungs or whatever made speech possible. There was something in seeing Ren annoyed despite having achieved the objective of saving Ron, like healing had satisfied one need but left another unresolved. The rage hadn't dissipated at all, hadn't been spent through the desperate sprint or healing effort. It was still there, still building, still demanding an outlet. Ron was saved, but mutants remained. Things to destroy remained. Things to kill to satisfy the hunger building in the chest where the seed vibrated and corruption spread, and something that wasn't entirely him demanded blood. Men observed him with a strange expression, noticing the black lines and things about Ren's appearance and behavior not fitting how he normally operated. He was panting in a manner suggesting considerable effort or excitement, and there was intensity in eyes that was disturbing in a quality not completely human. The black veins were more obvious now, and the electricity still crackling around Ren's hands. Men had seen Ren use it, had known it was possible, but the corruption and altered behavior created a picture that was concerning in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Yet men didn't ask beyond his superficial assessment. Recognizing this wasn't the moment for interrogation when priority was evacuating Ron to safety. Simply accepting the order with a quick nod and thanking him for the help with brief words communicating genuine gratitude without unnecessary elaboration. He lifted Ron carefully and began retreating toward the position within the broken walls, moving slowly and glancing back at Ron with an expression mixing gratitude with concern, like he wanted to say something but didn't know what, like he recognized something was wrong but didn't know how to address it. Moving away from his friend slightly from the breach, Ren channeled mana toward the new task of closing the containment wall that had been compromised. Reinforcement, being somewhat more solid than the original construction, had been thanks to additional attention he invested, ensuring it wouldn't easily collapse under new pressure, forming a barrier that was thicker, stronger than what defenders had managed during the initial construction when time and resources were limited. But mana used for that large-scale technique weakened his core further in manner permitting black lines to grow more. Chapter 940, Taming Rage 3. Expansion being the price he paid for each large energy investment. And using lightning during cleanup had been particularly costly in terms of feeding the corruption propagating through his system. Each technique fed the darkness. Each moment brought him closer to the tipping point where corruption overwhelmed his control completely and left only a beast wearing his face. He could feel it, the wrongness, that foreign presence in his cultivation base. The thing that wasn't him making decisions. And he couldn't stop it, could only ride the wave and hope he retained enough self to stop before doing something irreversible. Ren launched himself more chaotically against the nearest monsters after securing the breach. Abandonment of control being obvious in how he moved without appropriate consideration of positioning or energy conservation. Violence that was instinctive. It wasn't defense anymore. It was just pure and simple brutality, and it was consuming him. The corruption fed on his power and his rage in equal measure. And Rin kept killing, just kept killing until either the mutants were gone or he was something else entirely. Whichever came first. Lynn arrived after fighting her way through mutants interposing between her previous position and the place where Rin now operated. The last part of the trajectory being marked by corpses of creatures he'd eliminated with brutal efficiency. And she found Rin considerably more uncontrolled than he'd been when she'd seen him last, just moments before. The difference was stark. His movements were frantic, each strike landing with a force exceeding by much what was required. And the black veins weren't just visible. They were pronounced and prominent, pulsing with wrong energy that made her senses recoil. He wasn't fighting mutants anymore. He was slaughtering them. "Run!" she called while positioning herself near him, attempting to establish visual contact that could help anchoring his rationality. "You need to use a calmer pacing. You're going to exhaust yourself long before the battle ends, and you won't be available when we need you the most." It was advice with solid tactical merit, and she had called his name in a manner that should have been reflexive, that should have triggered an automatic response through conditioning that made it instinct rather than conscious choice. Yet nothing. She tried speaking to him again, but she was gradually realizing Ren didn't stop for anything nor fully listen, continuing his assault without pause, suggesting he wasn't appropriately processing communication. He didn't even acknowledge her presence, didn't look toward her voice, and didn't slow. Just kept killing with a speed that would have been impressive if it wasn't so terrifying. This was worse than she'd thought. Now, there was almost nothing of Ren's consciousness left, just violence. However, she noticed something else that was deeply disturbing in its implications. Ren wasn't losing energy as he should have been given the combat pace he maintained. In fact, he seemed to be gaining it somehow. Reserves increasing rather than diminishing when each attack should be draining mana or strength. That was wrong. Energy didn't come from nowhere. Mana didn't regenerate alone during active combat. Yet he struck faster with each passing minute instead of slower as fatigue would dictate. Acceleration being possible only if energy was increasing rather than depleting. And his energy signature also grew visibly. Mana signature expanding to a point where Ren's presence was more prominent than it had been at the battle start. It was like he was fresh, operating at full capacity or more despite hours of sustained combat. And the growth wasn't slowing, actually still getting stronger and faster, getting more dangerous with each kill. Lin observed closely and realized with growing alarm that Ren's shadow and his wood element combined into black tentacles at his feet. That was likely what appeared to steal energy from the mutants he massacred. And from the bodies touched by that shadow grew things. Vegetation, maybe, or fungi. Hard to tell, black growth sprouting and spreading across corpses. Dark vegetation / fungi briefly sprouting from the corpses and giving dim light before withering after extracting whatever they contained. Or were they fungi? The more she looked, the less certain she became. They had characteristics of both. Whatever they were working. The cycle was self-sustaining and run grew stronger. Kills faster. Process accelerates. And in a certain way, it seemed good that he eliminated the mutant beasts increasingly quickly. Efficiency being an advantage the defense desperately needed. More mutants dead meant fewer threatening civilians. Meant pressure reducing on exhausted defenders. Meant buying time for reinforcements or whatever miracle might save them. From some perspective, Ren's transformation was beneficial. But Lin didn't believe it was much of a benefit if Ren ended more uncontrolled as a result. If the price of increased power was rationality loss, the main thing separating him from the creatures he fought, especially when stolen energy increased his corruption, then it would be net negative in the end. She could see it happening. Each absorption making the black veins pulse brighter. Each kill feeding the darkness spreading through his system. Each moment bringing him closer to a point where he'd be lost completely. And then he would be consumed until there was nothing left except a monster wearing a familiar face. A monster that may end up being worse than the mutants. She had to stop him before transformation progressed to the point where it couldn't be reversed. Before the student she'd taught for years became something she'd have to kill to protect others from. Because caring about him meant not letting him become a monster he himself would try to eliminate. It was better to have the courage to stop it now. Else stopping would mean having to weigh bigger courage to end him while he was still redeemable. She tried speaking to him again, this time being much more insistent in tone while positioning herself directly in front of him to force acknowledgement. Run. Look at me. You need to stop and regain control before you go too far. The voice that had always worked. It should have worked, should have reached whatever part of him still existed beneath the darkness. Should have, but didn't. Imran finally reacted her, yet not in the manner Lin had wanted. He attacked her.